Okay, continuing on with aerobic respiration, we are on the second step of the entire pathway. So we're going to talk about pyruvate oxidation, which is kind of like an in-between step. And then, of course, the major step would be. So remember, there are three major steps discussed in your book regarding cellular respiration or aerobic respiration, to be more specific. We've already discussed glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis is basically just splitting glucose into two pyruvate molecules. Then what must happen is in between here is pyruvate oxidation, and then once pyruvate becomes oxidized, it becomes a totally different molecule, which can enter the citric acid cycle, which then basically this process completely breaks down that glucose molecule. So after the citric acid cycle, there's no more glucose. There's just the energy or potential energy in which glucose, which was extracted from glucose. And then the next segment will be discussing the oxidative phosphorylation step. Let's talk about what we've already discussed. We've already discussed glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Okay, and remember, it's just basically in reference to glucose, basically splitting glucose. Remember, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. It's split into two pyruvate molecules. And then during this process, we make two NADHs, and then we make two ATPs by substrate level phosphorylation directly. Then, now we got to talk about what happens to pyruvates. What happens to pyruvate depends whether or not oxygen is present. So remember, glycolysis occurs regardless of whether oxygen is present or not. Okay, so glycolysis isn't really dependent on oxygen. However, the rest of the steps of aerobic respiration are dependent on oxygen. So if oxygen is present, then pyruvate becomes oxidized. If oxygen is not present, something else happens to it, and we'll talk about that in a different segment. All right, so we are going to assume that oxygen is present in greater enough quantities where pyruvate becomes oxidized. Okay, so after glycolysis, assuming oxygen is present, pyruvate will enter the mitochondrion through a transport mechanism, and once it's in the mitochondrion, it becomes oxidized. So let's talk about the oxidation. Oxidation of pyruvate occurs in 3 steps. So here we can see pyruvate, and we've got this carboxyl group, which is highlighted in gray. What happens is, well, pyruvate's going to enter the mitochondrion through a set of transport proteins. And what's going to happen is basically pyruvate becomes decarboxylated. Okay, so what does that mean? The carboxyl group is going to be cleaved off of pyruvate. And what happens is basically carbon dioxide is released. So it's important to remember that this process happens twice, right, for every glucose molecule. Remember, for one glucose molecule, there are 2 pyruvates. So each pyruvate is going to undergo this process. So during this process, we release 2 carbon dioxides. Now, this is oxidation. Okay, so when oxidation happens, reduction must also happen. And it is done, of course, by a dehydrogenase complex, and it's called pyruvate dehydrogenase. All right, so what becomes reduced? NAD+, which is the oxidized form of NAD, gains electrons and becomes NADH. Now again, since there are 2 pyruvates, there's going to be 2 NADHs released. Then what happens is this coenzyme A gets attached to the molecule that's remaining after the decarboxylation. Now, the molecule that's remaining after the decarboxylation is called acetate. So when we add coenzyme A to acetate, we create acetyl-CoA. Okay, so acetyl-CoA is the final product of the pyruvate oxidation step. And remember, since there are 2 pyruvates, there will be 2 acetyl-CoAs, which will now enter the citric acid cycle. Okay, so the next step is citric acid cycle. So we can see here, we have glycolysis, we've talked about pyruvate oxidation, and of course, citric acid cycle is going to occur conveniently in the mitochondrion where acetyl-CoA is formed. So As an overview of citric acid cycle, we make more ATP by substrate level phosphorylation at this point. And also more NADHs are made, and then also FADH2. Okay, so both of these are electron carriers. All right, so let's look at the process a little bit more in detail. Now, the citric acid cycle is also called other things. So you might be familiar with Krebs cycle. Okay, so Krebs was the scientist who studied it or discovered it. And then it's also called the TCA cycle or the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And it's called the TCA cycle because the first molecule that's made in the cycle is a molecule that has 3 carboxyl groups. And that's what the tricarboxylic acid is actually referring to. Now, this textbook describes it as the citric acid cycle. Well, the citric acid is the first molecule that's formed in the cycle, which is the tricarboxylic acid. All right, so let's look at this cycle a little bit more in detail. Now, again, it occurs in the mitochondrion, and some ATP is made by substrate level phosphorylation, and then the NADH and FADH2 is going to be made, which is going to then transport those electrons to the oxidative phosphorylation, which will be a whole nother segment. This kind of gives an overview of the citric acid cycle. So remember, pyruvate oxidation, we already talked about that. So basically, pyruvate is one of the products of glycolysis. So we have 2 pyruvates, and remember, there are 3 carbon molecules. Well, each of them get decarboxylated. So now there are 2 carbon molecules called acetate. And then this is oxidation, so then reduction of NAD plus to NADH is done, and then the coenzyme A is attached to the acetate, which makes acetyl-CoA. It's acetyl-CoA that can actually enter the citric acid cycle. So the cycle is a cycle, so the molecule that it starts out with is going to end up at the end of the cycle. So nothing gets used up. So as you can see, one cycle of the citric acid cycle releases 2 more carbon dioxides. So at this point, we have 2 carbon dioxides released here, and then one cycle of the citric acid cycle is two more carbon dioxides. Now, remember, there's 6 carbons in glucose, so there's still 2 left. We'll talk about that when we get through this. 2 NADHs are made here. There's another NADH made over here at the end. And then here's where the FADH2 is made. And then we have some ATP made by substrate level phosphorylation. All right, so let's look at this some more in detail. So the first step of the citric acid cycle involves the entrance of acetyl-CoA into the cycle. So during this process, the coenzyme A is removed from the acetate, and then the acetate combines with oxaloacetate to form citrate. Okay, so it's citrate that is the tricarboxylic acid. So here we have a carboxyl group here, we have one here, and we have one here. Okay, so that's what gives its name, the citric acid cycle, or the TCA cycle, standing for tricarboxylic acid. Okay, so the next step is basically converting citrate to isocitrate. Okay, now it's just a different isoform or isomer. And then is converted to alpha-ketoglutarate, and you can see we have some NADH being formed, and this is reduction right here. So this is an oxidation reduction step, and it's done by a dehydrogenase. It's actually called isocitrate dehydrogenase complex, and during the process, isocitrate becomes decarboxylated. So you can see the release of 1 carbon dioxide occurs here. So now we've generated 1 NADH, and we've released 1 carbon dioxide. Then alpha-ketoglutarate is converted to fumarate, and this is another oxidation reduction reaction. It's called succinate dehydrogenase complex, which catalyzes the chemical reaction. Instead of any more decarboxylations, we just have a reduction. So FAD is reduced to FADH2. So then we have another product converted to malate, and then malate, the final step, converted to oxaloacetate, which is that starting molecule. Remember, this is a cycle. The starting molecule is going to be regenerated during the cycle. This is another oxidation reduction reaction, and this involves malate dehydrogenase complex. And there's no decarboxylation occurring here. However, there is a reduction. So NAD plus is reduced to NADH. Now, this is one cycle of the citric acid cycle. Remember, after pyruvate oxidation, there are two acetyl-CoAs from that original glucose molecule. So we need another cycle of the citric acid cycle in order to completely oxidize one glucose molecule. Now, this is kind of a summary here of glycolysis. Remember, we had glucose, and then during glycolysis, we split it into two pyruvates, two ATP and two NADHs. Then the two pyruvates, assuming oxygen is present, are going to be oxidated acetyl-CoA, which will then, both of them will enter the citric acid cycle. So after two cycles of the citric acid cycle, we can say that the glucose is completely oxidized. And during the citric acid cycle, we generate two more ATP, 8 NADHs, and 2 FADH2s. And then, of course, during this process, we have released a total of 6 carbon dioxides, including the ones that were released during pyruvate oxidation. Now, the 8 is including those from pyruvate oxidation as well, the NADHs. All right, so these are the outputs at this point from the beginning of glycolysis to the end of the citric acid cycle. Now, what happens next is that these NADHs and FADH2s are going to be transporting the electrons that they're holding to the electron transport chain during the entire process of oxidative phosphorylation, which is the final major step in aerobic respiration. These carbon dioxides will be exhaled, right? So in some about pyruvate oxidation and the 3 steps of pyruvate oxidation, remember, it includes step 1, decarboxylation. And this is an oxidation process, so then reduction of NAD plus to NADH, and then acetate is left, which is combined with the coenzyme A, and then the acetyl-CoA can enter the citric acid cycle. There are 8 steps of the citric acid cycle. During the citric acid cycle, 6 NADHs are made, just the citric acid cycle here. 6 NADHs are made, 1 FADH2, 2 ATP, and then 2 carbon dioxides are released. However, after both of these processes, all 6 carbons from glucose are going to be released as carbon dioxide as we exhale.